Useless Monster by Mute Crows. Chapter 27. Izuku felt better about standing in the field after the small meal with his friends. Many of the students who had been disqualified already were taking guesses on who they thought was going to win the games overall. It was something that heavily depended and varied with the theorized style of competition that would be used next to work towards said winner. There were some who assumed there would be 4 rounds of games, and some thought next was going to be a bracket system, which was what Izuku himself was leaning towards. The small amount of pride at watching the brackets show up on the screen was quickly pushed aside in favor of tracing the battle pairs. It was going to be interesting, to say the least. If they were going to follow standard procedures of brackets and go left to right, he was going to be the first match, the opponent being a student named Shiozaki. He looked around for the green hair and, upon seeing her directly, realized they were vines. That gave him a slight advantage over her in that she couldn't see his quirk like he could see hers. This might actually be a little easy. He shook his head a bit and went over plans in his head. The rules were to subdue, knock out, or push the opponent out of the arena. They all looked over at the concrete rectangle that Cementos had built during the break. It was an incredibly large field for a one-on-one battle, probably to allow maximum utilization of quirks for all parties. He takes a moment to feel out with his quirk and see if Shiozaki had any specific pains he could take advantage of. There was a moment of slight disappointment that there wasn't anything all that evident. They were told to clear the field for a moment, and Izuku just waited in the hall that he was assigned to enter from. He saw no point in going all the way back to their stadium seats just to be immediately called back out. When Mike announced his entrance, he strode out and stood a couple of strides within the playing field. Shiozaki's entrance was briefly interrupted as she brought up some complaint about the flavor words that Mike had added to her name. He reached out once more, hoping that now that it was just them in the field, he would catch something he hadn't before. Oh, her vines were aching. Base quirk use already starting to reach the bottom threshold of overuse. She must have gone big in the first 2 games. The more he focused, he realized he could feel out each vine individually all the way to their ends. They both stood on the field for all of 30 seconds before the match started. He felt the instant those vines dug into the earth, the way they tilted, angled, aimed, then surged through the concrete like it was nothing. He couldn't see them visually rooted, but waited regardless, not wanting to give away that he knew so quickly. Shiozaki stayed where she was as well, hands clasped together in front of her in prayer. He waited a moment longer, then at the last moment looked forward. The dodge was neat, precise. He could tell from the look on her face she hadn't expected that. The angle he had leapt in gave him enough of a view of behind her to see that she was close to the edge, but the vines efficiently had her anchored where she stood. It was smart. He felt the vines closing in again. He dove, rolled, sidestepped a short jump, then kicked off the vines that had shot at him from the side to get closer. Methodical. The vines came from below as well as behind and beside. He never took his eyes off of her as he worked his way closer. Mike's voice was near manic as he called out each and every dodge, called out each near hit. He felt the vines, no, the now briars, catch his pants and rip them. The scrapes weren't as bad as he expected. She blocked his sight of her, presuming that sight was needed for his predictions. But all it meant was that now she couldn't see him either. Perfect! He jumped off of and over a few more of the vines that were now swarming him. He was close enough, as was Shiozaki. The aching of the vines was getting stronger. It wasn't anything to blink at, but if he could just... He grabbed the ache on her skull at the roots of the vines and pushed hard! He put as much pressure into his grip as he could. He had no idea what this would do, but it didn't make the pain feel any worse. At least to him it didn't. She cried out in shock as he leapt over the vines that were around her just in time to see them sever themselves at shoulder length. She was no longer anchored, and the vines behind her fell to the ground. An opening. He gripped her shoulders and flipped over her, pulling her with him and flipped her roughly onto the ground. The buzzer sounded. Shiozaki is out of bounds. Midoriya wins the match. Midnight shouted, hand raised. Izuku panted as he looked and saw where Shiozaki's heel was over the line. What an unforgiving out-of-bounds call! He breathed as he stood up to his full height. Shiozaki was panting on the ground, winded. He held a hand out, pulling some of the aches from her shoulders as a silent apology. "Good match! I wasn't sure how this was gonna go," he told her. She looked at him with wide eyes before she accepted his hand. Once on her feet, she gave him a warm smile, bowing crisply. "Thank you for the match, Midoriya. May we have another opportunity to experience this kind of blessing." She turned to leave, hand going up to her head and rubbing it in confusion. He stood there a moment, unsure of what to do next exactly, as he looked down at his calves. Only now did he fully take in the amount of blood on them from having been stabbed or cut by the briars along Shiozaki's vines. As he crossed the field back to the entrance he had used, he saw the arcs of blood splatters on the ground. He hadn't even noticed being cut just when his pant leg had been torn. Once he was in the hall, he stopped just out of the light from the central arena. He wanted to find Yagi, but he was doubtful they would let just anyone up into that area of the stadium seating. For all he knew, those halls themselves were off limits. So he started to just walk until he was in a quiet part of the halls. The moment he deemed it secluded enough, he sat down. He wanted to process. Izuku had never used his healing quirk to hurt someone before. He knew, both logically and also because of his quirk, that he hadn't actually done any more damage to Shiozaki. He just had made her acutely aware of what would have otherwise been something she easily and naturally ignored. Made a mountain out of a molehill, essentially. Even still, it made him feel queasy suddenly. It felt wrong. The fact that he had not only done it, but that he did it experimentally on someone who had no way to consent to being his test run. He folded his arms over his knees and rested his forehead on them. Eyes closed, he tapped his fingers steadily, attempting to meter his breathing again. He pictured baton pass in his mind, holding it gently and rolling it around in his mind's palms. There was not much that he had thought he could do with it. It was just a sensory and healing quirk. The idea that he could manipulate the sensory register of others was incredibly new. In fact, he didn't think it was even a possibility before he had gone to UA. People talk about how quirks develop and get stronger the more you train them. Why now, though, was the question. It had to be because of One for All, right? It was a brand new factor into his life. Speaking of, he searched out with baton pass to locate his mentor. He was almost directly across the stadium, on a much higher floor than Izuku was now. Then he searched more. Aizawa was up in the commentator booth, if the barely there sore throat next to the itchy eyes was Yamada. The intense focused burn of calves up in the stands near Bakugo's buzzing forearms must be Ida. The air suddenly got incredibly cold, and the buzzer rang out, its echo bouncing off the walls. Todoroki must have won his match. There was a new tense vibration of muscle, like someone was fighting off hypothermia. It was already fading by the time he was back to his feet. The ice had been thawed then. He made his way back towards his class. The halls essentially cleared the entire way back, since everyone was out in the stands to watch the battles going on. He walked down the steps to the row Baraka and Ida were in. They greeted him and let him fall into the seats they had left between them. He felt his chest do something funny and smiled as Shinso knocked the back of his chair. It still felt so new. Friends! "Smart moves out there. You track the vines with your healing quirk?" Shinso asked. "Shinso, I'm not giving away my strategies when I could still face off against any of you that are still in the bracket." The bracket displayed the fact that Yao Momo was out of the game bluntly. The large slash and faded image on its own, now below the bright image of Todoroki, his next opponent. He looked to see that Bakugo and Tokoyami were currently in the field. He made a face at that. "You think Tokoyami won't do well?" Sero sat forward, having apparently noticed the sour expression. "Shadow is literally in the name of Tokoyami's quirk. You tell me how you think that will fare against a fire-based explosion quirk." He sank into his seat, feeling out his own injuries on his legs. He could hurry along their healing if he wanted to, but he wasn't sure if he felt like pulling up One for All in the stands to do that. He might just start sparking like he remembered doing in USJ. "Fair point." "How are you feeling about your match, Ida?" Uraraka asked, while laser focused on the current match. After all, she may be up against Bakugo as well, if it goes that way.
I think that going against a support class student will give me a unique match compared to the rest of the pairings, as I have the only non-hero class student competitor.
I think it's going to be a crap show. Shinso muffled his laughter behind his knuckles as the buzzer rang. Bakugo had Tokoyami subdued, Dark Shadow audibly crying even from where they were seated. Ida stood sharply, and they wished him luck as he strode out of their stadium section. Izuku watched the way Bakugo laughed haughtily, prideful as ever. He wished he had lost, just so he could be knocked down a few pegs. He kept his gaze forward as Bakugo took a seat a few rows back from him. Ida's entrance to the playing field was unexpected. He had on gear that was clearly made by Hatsume, which was allowed after he gave an honest and quite fair reasoning for having it on. Hatsume had requested it, and that was all that was needed for the clearance to be allowed. The match was something. After the first 2 minutes, Izuku understood that Ida had been strung out without even noticing. He was probably too earnest to have understood the underlying motives. He sank down further in his seat and closed his eyes with a heavy sigh. This was going to take a while, so we might as well get some rest in. There was the chance it would eventually let off if Ida could catch up to the fact that Hatsume, crowing praise and descriptions of her babies, knew exactly what every item did. The crowd was near rapturous with their applause when it finally ended over 10 minutes later. Everyone was unsure about the match itself, and Ida's frustrated cries echoed out over the crowd. He still was gracious enough to thank Hatsume for letting him use her creations during the match, though. Uraraka stood up and stretched. "I'm off!" she announced excitedly. They wished her luck as well, and she patted her cheeks a few times before grinning and racing up the stairs to go down to the field. This opponent was named Awase, and he had no outwardly visible quirk. Izuku sat up, leaning forward out of curiosity. The kid had no major aches beyond sore legs, which at this point everyone had from all the running. The round was started, and both considered each other quietly as the crowd went wild at the start of a new round. Izuku would have to see what Awase could do before he could guess the match. They both charged at the same time. Awase swung. It was too wide, too telegraphed. Izuku narrowed his eyes as Uraraka swept a wrist up to block the clear strike. Her wrist stuck immediately. A glue quirk? Quick match, but it could go either way. The boy moved as if to swing Uraraka, but she had already twisted her hand that was stuck to Awase to plant her fingers against him. His eyes went wide as his move to swing Uraraka was turned into momentum that swung himself directly up into the air. The only reason he didn't go flying out of the arena was their point of contact. Uraraka grinned as she started to run to the edge. Awase clearly got the idea of what this would spell out for him, but figured it out a smidge too late. He unstuck himself just as Uraraka swung her arm and got tossed straight out of bounds. The crowd roared in excitement at the quick match, and Izuku smiled. It had been clever. The match could have gone either way. Uraraka had just been quicker on her feet. She had also been lucky that Awase had glued them where it did. The back of Uraraka's hand would have spelt an entirely different story. Shinso's match against Juzo was simple. The kid was polite and returned the well-wishing Shinso offered. Then the match ended. Tetsu and Kirishima both tied, something to be settled at a later time via a tiebreaker. Mina was faced with Sero in another quick match. The two were adept and quick fighters, but Sero had a disadvantage in that Mina's acid easily ate through the tape he tried repeatedly to subdue her with. Mina had better hand-to-hand experience, too, from the looks of it. Their movements were a dynamic dance, especially on Mina's part. It went as well as it could have, and they both walked from the field with a handshake and laughter. Mike announced an intermission for the arena to be patched again after Mina's acid continued to eat through the ground where it had landed. Izuku took a breath and stood. The next rounds would be interesting. He was against Todoroki. Bakugo was after against Shinso, one that could fairly go either way depending on if Shinso could rile Bakugo into responding, but that wasn't likely. It would have had a better outlook for him if not for the recent experience Bakugo had with being captured by Shinso's quirk. Then it was Ida and Mina, which he was rather interested to see, followed by the last pairing of Uraraka against whoever won the tiebreaker. In the hall to his entrance for the match, heavy footfalls were rapidly approaching. The lack of slightly burning forearms meant it was a Bakugo, so he paused, waiting to see who could possibly be down this way. Sharp, acidic eyes fell on him as Endeavor rounded the end of the hall. They both stared at each other in a brief standoff before Endeavor started to approach him directly. His eyes reminded him of Bakugo back when...
You haven't used your quirk yet at the festival.
His growling voice made Izuku tense up. He looked up and glared at the hero through narrowed eyes.
Are you quirkless? I can't imagine you would be, having gotten into the hero program.
Endeavor stopped once the heat of his flames started to push Izuku's hair slightly. He was blocking the way to the field.
Shoto is going to fulfill his purpose and become the one to usurp All Might. You may as well back out instead of embarrassing yourself. My creation won't even blink at a quirkless opponent.
The wording makes his stomach turn. Even if Todoroki hadn't started his confession before lunch, the bruises mixed with this brief interaction would have filled in all the gaps. No wonder you only use your ice.
It's disrespectful to ignore your elders.
I have no reason to show you respect. Izuku was a breath away from shaking out of his skin, but he held himself firm. His heart raced feverishly as the air got even warmer, his hair billowing a bit as the hot air rose.
What was that?
Todoroki isn't your toy! Izuku brazenly pushed past Endeavor, not looking back as he strode towards the entryway to the field. It's no wonder you can never surpass All Might! Whatever Endeavor was going to say back was lost to the sound of the crowd as Mike energetically announced his entrance to the arena. He blinked rapidly and let out a shuddering breath. He had to keep it together. It all just made sense now when it came to Todoroki's behaviors. He was afraid of himself. The reasons were different and convoluted compared to how Izuku could relate, but even still, I want to help him. He watched as Todoroki entered the field, face scowling more than before the break. Izuku could only imagine that his father had found him before the match too. He felt out with his quirk to find he was a little sore from the previous match, but that, more so, he was tense from trying not to shiver. Izuku shifted his stance. He would have to use one for all if he wanted this match to last anything longer than mere seconds. That was fine. Just a brush and he should be fine. He knew he could do it, just like with the ball throw at the beginning of the year. Then afterwards, he could push it into baton pass like at USJ and fix his resulting injury faster. Todoroki lets out a breath that he's pretty sure may have had slight mist. The match started. He pulled one for all into his hands and flicked in tandem with the flex of Todoroki activating his ice. The blast caused a distant fog that battered Todoroki. Izuku knew he wasn't out of bounds, though. He had felt the impact of him hitting ice. The crowd's reaction was slightly delayed and accented by Yamada's shouted shock and the show of strength. He gritted his teeth at the crackle in his finger as the bones readjusted, piecing together with the pull of muscles reconnecting their fibers. The small sparks from One for All danced along his skin. When the mist dissipated, Todoroki was clearly calculating his next moves. Prior to this, the last time Izuku had actively used One for All as a human was at their base examination Aizawa had administered. Just as Izuku needed to know the full extent Todoroki would use, he would have to do the same for Izuku. The next surge of ice was shattered and subsequently redirected just as fast. This time, Izuku went with it. He charged with the shards and cut the distance between them in half by the time Todoroki uncrossed his arms that were protecting his face. There was the odd flex again. It had to be a similar quirk factor to Bakugo's then, and Izuku jumped. He shoved One for All over Baton Pass preemptively as he shot a blast straight down. His finger was horribly fractured, but it didn't shatter this time. Oh man, I can't believe that worked! He landed back further than he had been, and yet still had time to brace and deflect another blast of ice. Todoroki was getting slower, his muscles were aching with early onset hypothermia, and his breathing was definitely misting in the air around him now. There was the burning pain of skin too cold sweeping over Todoroki's entire right side. Why isn't he using his flame just to increase his body temperature? He doesn't have to use it offensively. "You're playing a dangerous game, Todoroki!" he yelled before deflecting another surging wave of ice. Todoroki grit his teeth and swung his arm wide to balance an especially firm stomp. The ice was still slower than normal.
"I could say the same for you." "You haven't touched me yet!"
More ice, another blast of air.
"You're injuring yourself readily enough."
Izuku braced and sent off a blast. He switched hands as he ran with the air, filling the vacuum he created. It still wasn't close enough.
"In terms of an endurance match?"
Izuku set off 2 blasts back to back, forcing Todoroki to keep his face protected. He grinned, though, when he was finally close. The sound of the crowd faded out as he zeroed in on his classmate.
"I'll win!"
Izuku swung. It connected, hard. Todoroki wheezed as the wind was knocked out of him, folded over the punch. He bounced back and debated a second blow, but could feel the moment Todoroki prepared more ice. The frost was covering his visible skin.
"You're going to freeze if you don't use your fire!"
It was a simple fact, irrefutable. Todoroki's refusal to use the parts of him that he feared were going to be the end of him. There were times that you had to use your whole being to survive. Izuku knew the fact incredibly well. Viscerally so.
"I can warm up after I beat you."
Todoroki's glare was dark. He threw more ice. He was visibly shaking now. Izuku was still able to use half of one hand. The other was rapidly fixing itself with One for All's help.
"You're making yourself just as much of a liability as I do!"
He dodged a wave of ice without breaking it.
"If you refuse to use your own abilities to their full extent!"
Todoroki snarls as he sends the largest wave of ice yet at him. The ice was covering his leg now, and he shook it to break it free from the thin layer.
"You're blind if you think I'll just play into whatever my father has planned, just as guilty of looking away as everyone else."
Izuku had already been preparing to swing, but switched to actually putting his arm into the heat of One for All, angry, no, seething that he was being equated to the kind of people who have hurt him the worst! The resulting concussive blast nearly sent them both out of the ring. Todoroki was just barely saved by his ice. Izuku, having leapt forward to reduce any drag he would get, was already running forward once again. His arm felt raw with the way it had fractured, but he kept pushing. Todoroki's whole body was shaking as he stood up again. He looked mildly dazed and he watched Izuku for his next move. He had been put into the defensive.
"Fire quirks don't make you a monster!"
"Not like me."
"They don't even come close!"
He continued his strides steadily.
"Fire can save so many lives! Do you know how many nights people on the streets plead for even a lick of warmth?"
"How many nights I have?"
"You're refusing to save yourself out of pure spite!"
"You don't know. You don't get." Todoroki tried to interrupt, but Izuku sneered audibly.
"You're a fool! If you think a hero can succeed at saving people if they don't put their entire quirk, their entire being into it!"
"Hypocrite!" "Not important right now," he argued to himself.
"I'm not going to use his quirk in a fight."
Todoroki's body sluggishly pulled, preparing more ice. Izuku flicked with his hand that still had usable fingers. The only reason Todoroki stayed in the ring was the thick ice he had layered up behind himself. He hadn't even gotten much ice moving in Izuku's direction in the first place. Todoroki glanced back behind him to where Endeavor was in the stands.
Are you kidding me?
Izuku leaned down and grabbed a chunk of ice, hurling it at Todoroki.
"Look at me!"
The kid at least afforded him the attention to look offended by the action. Izuku grabbed another piece.
"You weren't Endeavor! You can be a hero outside of your father!"
He threw the piece and fell at Todoroki's feet. The anger melted from Todoroki as he watched it land and looked up again to see the tears in Izuku's eyes.
"Don't you want to be a hero?"
They both stood there, breaths fogging the chilled air in large clouds. He faintly registered the confused narration Mike was giving before he saw the ice sliding off of Todoroki. He got a shaky smile as he saw it. The steam felt like vindication as the ache of frozen skin and muscles faded. "Why are you smiling?" He laughed incredulously. Izuku squared his stance. "You unmade your victory. Why?" Their breaths no longer created even a hint of fog. A steady wind kicked up as cold air swept into the space now hot air vacated.
You won't win this endurance match anymore, Midoriya.
He swept his arm wide, the flames bursting free and creating an intense pressure shift. The air around his hand sparked small vacuums and it collapsed on themselves. Izuku's smile stilled. His stomach dropped.
And I'm going to prove it.
But the voice wasn't his anymore. His pulse raced wildly. He felt the ground shift in the stands. He felt both Yagi and Aizawa's egg jerk sharply. He couldn't hear anything as his vision stayed locked on the flame. In that moment, he lost. In that moment, Izuku froze.